We have dealt with worse hair days than this in the history of this channel, and we will get through this one as well. Hi everyone, my name is Charlie, and today I have my December wrap-up. One moment while Sally just gets herself comfortable. Yes, hi everyone, my name is Charlie, and today I have my December wrap-up. I ran out of the good hairspray today, so I used something that's made my hair smell like what I associate with a certain type of older lady. It's getting on my chest already, so I will be washing my hair again after this, which is fun because I've been giving my hair a rest. Do you know, the amount, that's all people are going to know Charlie for in the end of times. He talked about his hair too much. Well, wouldn't you? December was a busy month for me, and I did not expect to read the number of books that I have done, but that comes from having the last week between Christmas and New Year off. I didn't get this off last year. I'm not sure about the year before that, but I have been working it quite a lot, or actually, yes, I've worked this week for the last few years, always going in on one day at least, and for whatever reason that affects my reading. However, this year I asked, I got it all off, and that's where a lot of this reading happened. But let's talk about a few books that I won't be mentioning here because they were rereads. Firstly, we have A Christmas Carol. I used to be one of those people who liked to read this on Christmas Eve. Worked Christmas Eve this year, so didn't get the chance. So I read this on the 27th of December and was surprised to discover I also read it on the 27th of December last year. We like tradition. And still a firm favourite, still really enjoy the Robert Inkpen illustrations. And Dickens really talks about a lot of themes that he's talked about elsewhere, but he manages to basically just get the very essence of them in this book. Yes, I'm still disappointed there are no Muppets in it. Then we have The Christmas Chronicles by Nigel Slater, which I've become one of those basic people that has reread this for a few years now, reading it like a diary from November until the last day in December. And it's just, again, become a small tradition, which I never thought that I would say about what is ostensibly a cookbook. And then I have Christmas Days by Jeanette Winterson, which is doing what The Christmas Chronicles does, only in a much slimmer volume and with short stories instead of diary entries. And the short stories in here, some are brilliant, some are a bit subpar, but like it says on the back, brilliantly imaginative, and I would agree with that. I still think that my favourite is the very traditional story, which is The Silver Frog. I think that that's a very traditional short story that could be shared with children. Again, I think that I preferred hearing the writer talk about her experiences of Christmas than I did the short stories themselves. Although, there are some straightforward stories that I hadn't expected from Jeanette Winterson. There is one where it switches perspective a few times and it doesn't necessarily make sense, and I don't worry about it. I don't know why I said worry, and the craft of it frustrates me somewhat. But it's there. I can't remember which one it is now. I don't know whether this is something I'll read again next year or whether I'll leave it another few years before reading it. But it's one of the better books that is Christmas themed. There are a few other Christmas books that I didn't get to, and some more in here that you'll get to hear about, namely the cosy classic British crime ones that I planned to read, which were The Christmas Card Crime and Other Stories, and A Surprise for Christmas and Other Seasonal Mysteries. Both short story collections I intended to get to and didn't. And then I also wanted to read Frostheart Rise of the World Eater. Not necessarily a Christmas book, but I wanted to get that out of the way and didn't. But we're past that now. Can't do it about it. So let's talk about the new books the new to me books that I read. So, firstly, I teamed up with Charlie Brooke for Charlie and Charlie's Christmas Cracker, and we did 4 instalments each week in December. The first and the final instalments are on my channel, and the second and third are on Charlie's channel. and there is a playlist. I'll leave a link to it in the description. But each week we set ourselves a challenge of what we were going to read the following week. And the first book that got chosen for me was Wynd Volume 2, The Secret of the Wings by James Tynion IV and Michael Dialynas. I read the first volume of Wynd earlier in 2022 and very much enjoyed it. This is a world in which magic has been outlawed, and our protagonist has been hiding his very clear physical difference from people, and has even got a job hidden from the world because of the way they would react to his presence. And there is a whole host of gay love within this book. Well, it's more like attraction. It's teenage attraction, and it's well done. And then we get to this book. In this book, in this installment, this volume, one of our protagonists is basically unconscious for the entire thing. And we have vampires that have teamed up with the king to go and find these characters. And it's tense and it's bloody. And one thing I appreciate about these writers is that they don't mind killing off a character to show the brutality of the world. And it seems fitting when it happens. It doesn't feel like it's being shoehorned in there for some sort of reaction from the reader. But with this book, I had an issue with the relationship, and I know that when it comes to a fantastical story, you're usually following a set plot. I mean, you could say that for, well, when it comes to a fantasy story, you're usually following a set structure, and one of those aspects of the hero's story is always that in the end, they're going to get some form of reward. And the reward that our hero got at the end of this portion of the story rubbed me the wrong way, because it didn't feel as though there'd been any lead up to it. It seemed to have come out of nowhere, and there didn't seem to be any real feeling there. I didn't understand the emotions, unless emotions were just running high. And in the subsequent volumes, we're going to examine what happened at the end of this book, which I think is necessary because it just seemed to come out of nowhere. I know what the protagonist's feelings were, but it didn't make sense for what we've been told about this other character. However, one thing that I did like about this volume was getting to know more about the history of this world, and also more about the magical entities that live outside of the city that we visited in the first book. And I look forward to seeing how these writers build on that and see where the tale is going to go. However, I believe I actually have a very long wait until the third volume is published. So I need to find out whether you can read each little instalment on its own. That would be something to look up. But either way, if you are looking for a fantastical comic book series with a lot of gay representation, queer representation, then Wynd is quite a fantastic one. The second book that Charlie chose for me to read is The Virgin Mary's Got Nits by Gervaise Phinn, and I don't know where my copy is. This is short stories and anecdotes that the author has about his time working as a school inspector. And I found it humorous. I liked the first 30 pages and the anecdotes that were featured there, and I liked hearing about the author's childhood. But towards the end, and I understand that this is The Virgin Mary's Got Nits, so I should have guessed from the title it was going to take a religious bent, but I didn't expect it to take as much of one as it did in the final 12 pages. There was some humour there that I appreciated. Indeed, in the final part, there's a story where a priest is going and talking to a load of shepherds' children, and they get very involved in asking questions about Herdwicks and what breed of sheep was it when the shepherd lost the one sheep that he went to find when he got all these hundreds there. And I found that tale funny, being the son of a shepherd. Well, I call myself the son of a shepherd. He's a sheep farmer. I don't know whether they're the same thing. But I could imagine my young nephew, indeed my younger brother at that age, going and asking the same things that these children were asking of the priest. And so I like that. But some of the short stories felt very twee and just didn't suit my sensibilities. And I found that this is also including stuff from his other books. And so I think that If you're a Gervaise Phinn fan, then this might be a book for you. But it was a one and done type book for me, that it was nice to read in this festive period and have a bit of fun, but there wasn't really any meat to it. Then I read The Wren Boys by Caroline Duffy. This was one of her short poems that she has in these hardback editions where they're illustrated very beautifully, and I liked it. And that's all I can say. Again, it's just one poem about the Wren boys and this wren hiding from these people who've come out to kill it, because you're supposed to kill a wren because it's for some traditional reason. And it basically gives you an alternative look at certain Christmas traditions that might be a bit more brutal. And the poetry was good. It told a story. Is it necessarily something I need to read again? No. Side note, when we went and did Poems and Pints at the Button Warehouse for our festive edition, which I shared my poem on here just before Christmas, someone read the entirety of Caroline Duffy's new poem, Advent Street. So I had no need to go out and buy that one either. Then I read The Haunting Season, Ghostly Tales for Long Winter Nights. I've been reading this since October, going to one story every Sunday, apart from the final week before Christmas, because I chose not to read Elizabeth McNeil's story Monster on Christmas Day, but read it the Wednesday beforehand. And I'm glad I did, because that was a very dark ending to this book indeed. I think that this is a fantastic short story collection, and I'm keeping this in the hopes of making it a tradition to read this book as well, because all of these modern writers have managed to craft gothic, spooky, supernatural tales in a fantastic fashion, and they really were chilling. They did everything that you look forward to in a ghost story. There was part of me that didn't understand why all of them had to be historical, why we couldn't have a few modern ones in there, but looking at the authors, who all are, I think, a bit renowned for writing historical fiction, it makes sense to me. Yes, I would have liked to have seen some more modern tales, and maybe that's something we'll get in future. Maybe we'll get a second selection of short stories that are all set in the modern day and are all ghostly as well, because I think that that would be an interesting thing to look at. And not these modern tales where it's modern, but the only reason it's modern is so that we can have somebody who's flashing back all the time to history. I want a modern ghost story. You can do it. Get a ghost in a phone, get a ghost on an app, I don't care. I just need a modern ghost story. That's it. That's not to say that this collection wasn't great. I could not say as I had any favourites. I think that they were all fantastic. And I said in my last wrap-up how there were writers I've read before whose work I didn't think was the best. You know, they were one-and-done type books, or I'd had poor experiences reading them. This has made me want to go and explore them again, or has given me it's given them a second chance, is what I should say. It's made me think that I might go and read some of their future works and give them, and I will give them a second chance now. But definitely recommend this as a short story collection, especially to those of you who might like ghost stories, or if you were looking to read any of these authors and wanted to get a taste of their writing. This next book is the third and final book that Charlie chose for me to read for our Christmas cracker, and there is a story behind this book. When Charlie and I met in Crewe, we saw Babel by R.F. Kuang at Waterstones, and it was a rather expensive book. I believe that this was, so it was $16.99 new. And I haven't got any of R.F. Kuang's work in hardback, so I said, no, I won't get it. And then Charlie was in a charity shop down south, and it was this copy for $6.99, and got in touch with me whilst I was at work. And they were very kind at this charity shop and had saved it. Charlie bought it, I sent her the money, and now I own Babel. I was very glad for Charlie having chosen this book, because it was one of my most anticipated reads of the latter end of 2022. This book follows the character of Robin Swift, who, when he is young, his entire family dies in a plague, let's say, in Canton, and he is brought over to England by this English professor who begins to teach him all of these different languages. So he teaches him Latin and Greek, and also tries to eliminate the Cantonese that Robin knows because Mandarin is seen as the more knowledgeable language for people to have and the one that's more suiting to the English sensibilities. There's a lot in this book about colonialism and colonising languages, and how even translators aren't necessarily translating the works from their original language, they're translating them from an easier language. So say something in Cantonese has been translated into French, the English are translating the French edition. That being said, there is also magic running throughout this novel in the form of silver. Pieces of silver are used to power England. There has been an alternative industrial revolution, and so if certain translators in the Tower of Babel, which is at Oxford University, inscribe silver in certain ways using certain pairings, it can cause horse and carts to go faster, it can cause fishing boats to have better harvest, but get more fish out of the sea, that sort of thing. This book really goes into the disruption of that and questions why, when they have this technology, they aren't using it to help the poorer in society. And Robin begins to recognise the privilege that he's got, but also recognise that had it not been for these rich white men, he might have been in the same place as others, and thus we begin to see the beginnings of a revolution in this novel. I liked what this book was saying about colonisation and the colonisation of languages. I like the way that it pointed out the flaws in the white saviour narrative. And indeed, there are a few white saviours in this novel, and they are villainised perfectly. That is one thing about R.F. Kuang. Within her novels, you don't ever really get antagonists and protagonists. It's never this sort of heroes and villains type story. Everyone shows a multitude of human emotion and how good people will do bad things and bad people will do bad things under the guise of thinking that what they were doing was good. So I suppose that then R.F. Kuang is saying there are no good people or bad people, it's a misinformation type thing, or it's people thinking them superior to others, so maybe they are bad people. There's a lot of questioning going on in this novel that I appreciated. On the day that we were supposed to do our final discussion of the books that we'd read, our final Charlie and Charlie Christmas cracker, I said to Charlie, I won't finish this book. And something happened, and I ended up doing nothing but reading this book that day. I flew through the final few hundred pages of this. I understood what everyone meant when they said that this book begins slowly, but then picks up pace. And that made sense because that's how I've experienced R.F. Kuang in the past. The Poppy War, for example, has a rather languid start before everything kind of hits the fan. The issue that I ended up having with this book is that I have read The Poppy War and its sequels, and the resolution to this story was so similar to the resolution in The Burning God that I just begin to question the way in which Kuang crafts a story. Because I would have liked to see this end differently. I felt as though that was possible, but the author has either got this idea of the way that a hero story ends, because she even questions what she's about to do within her own writing. And I feel as though the ending was too close to that other ending, and now it's left me wondering, can the author write anything different? Are they always going to follow the familiar trajectory? Another issue I had was that the author still falls back on this idea that if she's unable to figure out how to use a character or utilise them to the best of their character, they just get removed from the page. It seems as though that happens whenever she might be fully forming a character. A character might be beginning to gain more depth and they might have more of a story to tell, but the author doesn't want that. The author just wants this, not catalyst, but the author just wants somebody there who might not have much personality or we haven't seen much, so that the protagonist she's chosen, in this case Robin, can just go through all their thoughts and roll off their thoughts, and the character there is just there to argue and not necessarily give any sort of personality. They're just there to give an argument so that Robin can give his perspective. I just felt disappointed in the end with this one. I'm keeping it. I think that, as with the Poppy War, it's something that I could revisit. Even R.F. Kuang having all of these issues that I found that other people haven't found, it's still a pretty good novel. I just wanted a different resolution because it's one that I've seen before. I've seen her do before in another novel. And also, in the way that the author removes characters from the page, it does remove any certain character growth. And there was a trope that we've discussed as harmful in the past used in here that I can't mention because it will be very, very huge spoilers indeed, but that disappointed me. The next book that I have to talk to you about is There But Further by Ali Smith, and this was a 11th hour addition to my reading. I was about to have a bath, and I was looking through the books that I was in the middle of last year, and I remembered that I'd actually read the first 70 pages of There But Further. But well, I may as well continue it. And the thing about Ali Smith's writing is that there is a lot of... the text is rather big, and the margins are rather big, so you get through them rather quickly. And so I read 150 pages of this on Thursday night and finished it on Friday morning. So this book begins with a dinner party. This man called Miles has been invited to a dinner party by a man he only met the week before because the man doesn't want to go on his own. And Miles ends up locking himself in this middle-class homeowner's spare bedroom and refuses to come out. And he's in there for a few months. And this book discusses the fallout of that. It's very much a quite in-your-face book. So you know that Ali Smith has dropped this eccentric gentleman into the story to garner some sort of reaction and see how the people react to this intrusion. So we begin with Anna, who hasn't seen Miles in about 30 years, but has been called by the homeowner to try and get him to leave. And so the first part, we get to see how Miles impacted her life. In the second part, we get to see how he impacted the life of the man who invited him to this party. And then we move on to a character we've never seen before going back to the dinner party. Well, the house that the dinner party took place in. If you've read Ali Smith's seasonal quartet, then this does feel like a precursor to that. It is discussing the upcoming election from 2010. We have a child who is somewhat precocious, who seems to be a little bit all-knowing about the world, and we have all of these references and allusions that Ali Smith is at times allowing you to figure out what she's talking about and hoping for some discussion from those allusions and references, and at other times is basically does just tell you why she included them and what she's referencing. At times, I was thoroughly enjoying the fast pace, the verve and the vivacity of this novel. At other times, I was like, I've seen this before. I've read this before. If you've ever read an Ali Smith novel, then you've seen this, but at the same time, I was like, wow, if we wanted to talk about a good Ali Smith novel that's doing everything Ali Smith does and does well, then this is a good example of Ali Smith doing good. Considering I read Companion Piece earlier in the year and thought that that was an absolute shit show of a novel, then this was good. But there is part of me that's fed up with these precocious, all-knowing children. There's this part of me that was really annoyed about this time jump that we had that shifted to this character. I mean, in the end, it does make sense and you get to learn how that happened. I didn't know why it was there, unless it was just to try and build on the character of Miles and give him a life outside of this spare bedroom. It does also seem to just end out of nowhere. Like, I'm not saying that every book, and I've said this before, not every single book has to have this huge climactic moment, but there has to be some sort of point that I can label as, oh, that's the climactic point. And I don't know whether the climax in here was supposed to be so quiet. I can't mention what it was without it being a spoiler, but I don't know whether that was intended to be the climax, what I'm thinking was, or whether it really did just fizzle out. So, I don't know. A lot in here to do with language and wordplay that I like and all of that. And the dinner party, I think, was done quite well for a dinner party, because it reminded me of some of my favourite scenes in Dinner Ladies, where I feel like they must have been so difficult to shoot and block and all of that, because every single character's talking and got something to say and add to the conversation, which is what was going on here. And I thought that that was done incredibly well. And I would have liked to have seen more of the dinner party, and it was great to see how Miles came to this decision to go into this spare bedroom. And there's a lot in there about taking up space and the space that we own, and it seems like there's this argument for what makes art, and there's almost a kind of keeping up appearances type thing, where the person whose house Miles ends up staying in begins to really appreciate all of the fame that comes from having this lodger, and you get this sense that everybody else would like this lodger so that they could have their 5 minutes of fame as well. So there is a lot to be said for this book. But I just don't know. And finally, the last new book that I read in 2022 is a bit bittersweet, because I'd hoped to read this book in November before reading the final book in the series in December, and that didn't happen. And it was partly my fault, but it was also partly due to the fact that I just couldn't find the time to dedicate wholeheartedly to it, and that is The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope, the 5th and penultimate book in the Barchester series. In this book, Lily Dale is in love with Adolphus Crosby, but John Ames is in love with Lily Dale, and Adolphus Crosby is a bit of a cad who's thinking only about what the best relationship could do for his place in society. He becomes engaged to Lily Dale quite early on before regretting that, and we get to see the fallout of this engagement, the politics and familial politics, as well as the monetary politics surrounding this engagement and any engagement at the time. And it almost felt like a comedy of errors at times, due to the way that everybody was in love with the wrong person. When I said I was reading this, Katie of Books and Things got in touch and said that this was her favourite, and she's looking forward to hearing what my thoughts were. I know that Sarah of Hardcover Hearts and Leo of Leo's Little Book Life both enjoyed this book and seemed to really enjoy The Last Chronicle of Barset, which is what I'll be getting to, hopefully, sooner rather than later. But this book did take me some time to get through, and I've said before, I don't know whether that's because the prose in here felt more dense, and I likened it to The Way We Live Now, because Trollope here seems to finally have figured out his thoughts behind love, marriage, and the interplay with that, and the finances of the time, and how your finances could almost trump love when it came to marriage. This book I felt was somewhat slow, but it also begins to bring a lot of characters together, not just from the Barsetshire series, but from the subsequent Palliser series, with Plantagenet Palliser making an appearance in this novel. I'll admit that, again, with this book, it wasn't until the final 300 pages that I felt like I was really into it, and I got through those a lot faster than I did the first 300 pages. With the first 300 pages, it felt like I was going over familiar ground again, because I've seen this story of love and the way that it was with finance in both Dr. Thorne and Family Parsonage now. And to be quite honest, Anthony Trollope has managed to discuss that theme in a different fashion every single time. It's not like you are getting the same story over and over again, which is what I'd worried about when I first came to reading these books. I mentioned in my most recent wrap-up how I didn't necessarily connect with any of the characters. I didn't necessarily connect with Lily or Belle or Mrs. Dale. The only thing that I did have was this vehement dislike of Adolphus Crosby. And that is what got me through this book, because Adolphus Crosby is the very definition of having your cake and eating it too. He is in love with one person but doesn't like how that will make his finances look, so instead decides to align himself to another person. And yes, it was great to see the fallout of that, the way that this would affect his place in society, the way that he was looked on by people and peers within his social circles. I liked that Lily Dale, despite being billed as this character who's somewhat quiet and naive, still has enough self about her and enough to say when everybody is trying to control her, she still makes her own decision. Whether that's the decision that the reader wants her to make, I won't say, but I do think it's interesting that Trollope had her make this decision, and I am certain that John Ames and Lily Dale must turn up in the last Chronicle of Barset. They must do, because their story did not feel as though it was over. It didn't feel like it had the Anthony Trollope finality to it, which I've seen in other books. So technically, I could say that as a penultimate book in a series, this is doing what it ought to do, which is tell a story, not necessarily give us a complete resolution to it, and also might really have been a bit deceptive, because I might have read this entire book thinking it was a story of one person. It was actually the story of another. But there are a lot of characters in here, and there are a lot of characters all going about their business, and it just, sometimes I have to admit, it did feel a bit meandering. It did. Like, okay, I get this. We've passed a few months now. What's going on? Going against the grain of what other people have said, this was not my favourite of Anthony Trollope's works that I have read so far. I still think that within the Barsetshire series, Framley Parsonage might have overtaken Dr. Thorne for me. I read both rather quickly, but I very much... The protagonist within Framley Parsonage, Lucy Roberts, was closer to the kind of heroine that I like to see in fiction than Lily Dale was. But I agree that there is definitely a place for characters like Lily Dale in fiction, and I like to see that while she's not forthright, she still sticks to her guns. And it's good to see somebody sure enough of themselves that they will go against the wants of the people who are trying to manipulate their lives. Still, a great edition. Still very glad to have read it. Still appreciate what Anthony Trollope had to say about this topic that we've discussed before, but not necessarily my favourite of the series. And them's the books. That was the final wrap-up of 2022. I think that it turned out being a rather good month. This year, I have got some plans with my reading. I'm hoping not to jump on so many bandwagons and try so many different projects this year in order that I read some more of the books on my shelves, because there are so many books on my shelves and more coming that I've wanted to get to for the longest time, but other books have got in my way. Also, whilst I probably am not going to be editing a novel as much this year and doing so much with the novel, it might be a better reading year. But I do have several other novels to write, so we will see how this goes. If you have read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope you have enjoyed this video. And until next time, that is all.